It started with the little things. A misplaced receipt, a phone call he wouldn't take in front of me, and the way he'd grown distant in bed, always turning away after a curt goodnight. I thought I was imagining it at first, convincing myself that I was being paranoid, that my husband of 5 years, Jason, was just stressed with work. After all, his job in real estate often kept him out late, meeting clients and finalizing deals. But the night I found the key, everything changed. Jason had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted after a supposed late-night meeting. His briefcase was sitting open on the coffee table, papers spilling out. I wasn't snooping, I swear. I was just cleaning up, gathering the mess he'd left behind. And that's when I saw it. A small unmarked key attached to a red tag. It didn't belong to our house, nor to his office. I'd been there enough times to know. Curiosity gnawed at me like a persistent ache. I tucked the key into my pocket, ignoring the guilt bubbling up inside me, and told myself it was probably nothing. But it wasn't nothing. The next morning, while Jason was at the gym, I found myself holding that key in my hand, standing in front of our laptop. My heart raced as I logged into his email, a line I had never crossed before. What I found made my stomach turn. Among the hundreds of work emails and newsletters, there were personal messages, receipts for purchases I'd never seen, and confirmations for dinners at restaurants we'd never visited together. The worst was an email from his landlord. Your rental payment for Unit 12B is confirmed. Thank you. Unit 12B? Rental payment? My mind reeled. Jason and I owned our home. Why would he need to rent another place? That weekend I followed him. I felt like a villain in my own life, tailing my husband as he left the house claiming he was going to show a property. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached, but I couldn't let go. I had to know. When he pulled up to a sleek apartment complex downtown, my heart nearly stopped. I watched from my car as he stepped out, a bouquet of flowers in hand, and walked inside like he belonged there. The key burned in my pocket. I waited until he left, almost an hour later, and then I went in. My pulse thundered in my ears as I climbed the stairs to Unit 12B. My fingers trembled as I slid the key into the lock, half expecting it not to work. But it did. The door opened to a cozy, lived-in space that smelled faintly of lavender and vanilla. It was nothing like our minimalist home. Here, there were soft blankets draped over the couch, framed photos on the walls, and a vase of fresh flowers on the dining table. And then I saw her. She was sitting on the couch, a book in her lap, her brown hair falling in soft waves around her face. For a moment we both froze, staring at each other in stunned silence. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice sharp but shaky. "I'm his wife," I said, the words catching in my throat. Her eyes widened, and the book slipped from her hands. "What?" We stared at each other, two strangers bound by the same man. My anger surged. "How long have you been seeing him?" She looked at me like I'd slapped her. "Seeing him? Jason's my fiancé." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. "Fiancé?" The room tilted, and I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. "No," I said, shaking my head. "That's not possible. We're married. 5 years. We live together." She paled, her hand flying to her mouth. "He told me he was divorced," she whispered. We spent the next hour unraveling the lies he'd woven between us. He'd been seeing her for 3 years. 3 years. She'd thought he was divorced, a man starting over after a failed marriage. Meanwhile, I had thought we were building a life together, saving for a future that now seemed like a cruel joke. He had a second life, a second home, a second me. When Jason returned later that night, he found us both waiting for him. The look on his face when he walked through the door was almost comical. His confident stride faltering, his jaw dropping. "Jessica? Emily?" he stammered, his eyes darting between us like a cornered animal. I stood up, every ounce of pain and betrayal boiling to the surface. "How could you do this to us?" To me. Emily was beside me, her hands clenched into fists. "You lied to me, Jason. For years." His excuses tumbled out in a panicked rush, each one more pathetic than the last. He claimed he'd felt trapped, that he loved us both, that he hadn't meant to hurt anyone. But his words only made it worse. When Emily and I left that night, we left together. We exchanged numbers, vowing to keep in touch, to make sure we held him accountable. In the weeks that followed, I grieved the life I thought I had. But I also found strength in the unlikeliest of places. Emily. She became a friend, a partner in rebuilding what Jason had destroyed. Together we shared our stories, our pain, and eventually our laughter. Jason tried to reach out to both of us, but we ignored him. He didn't deserve the chance to explain or apologize. We had moved on, and he was left with nothing. Looking back, I realized that discovering Jason's betrayal was both the worst and best thing that ever happened to me. It shattered my world, yes, but it also forced me to rebuild stronger and wiser than before. Jason had his second life, but now so did I. A life where I chose myself, my happiness, and my future. A life where the lies were gone, replaced by the truth I had fought to find. In the days after I left Jason, everything felt surreal. The betrayal hung over me like a dark cloud, but underneath it was a quiet resolve I hadn't expected. I had no idea how to start over, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this define me. Emily called me every day. First it was to check in, to ask if I was okay. But soon, our conversations became something more. We started piecing together Jason's lies, comparing notes, unraveling the web he'd spun between us. It was almost therapeutic, dissecting the man who had fooled us both. We laughed bitterly at the absurdity of it all, the way he had managed to keep two separate lives going for so long. He must have been exhausted. The more we talked, the more we realized how much we had in common beyond Jason. We were both driven, ambitious women who had put too much of ourselves into a man who didn't deserve it. Emily had a sharp wit and a dry sense of humor that often caught me off guard, pulling me out of my darker moments. She had a way of making me see the situation not just as a tragedy, but as an opportunity, a chance to start fresh. One evening, about a month after the confrontation, she called me with an idea. "You know," she said, "we could sit here and wallow, or we could do something about it." Do something? I asked, unsure where she was going with this. Take control of the narrative. Jason thought he could play us, keep us in the dark. Let's make sure he never does this to anyone else. I didn't understand at first. What could we possibly do? But Emily was already steps ahead of me. She had contacted a lawyer, someone who specialized in cases involving fraud and deception. We weren't just going to expose Jason, we were going to hold him accountable. The process was grueling. We had to gather evidence, emails, receipts, texts, anything that showed the extent of his lies. It was painful to sift through the remnants of my marriage, but it was also empowering. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control. Emily and I met regularly to compare notes, often over coffee or a glass of wine. What started as a mission to take down Jason became something more. We began sharing stories about our lives before him, our hopes and dreams, the things we had lost sight of while caught up in his world. She told me about her love for painting, how she'd put it aside to focus on her career. I confessed that I'd always wanted to write, but never felt like I had anything worth saying. "Maybe this is your story," she said one night, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Write about him. Expose him. Turn all this pain into something meaningful." The idea scared me, but it also lit a fire inside me. Over the next few weeks, I began jotting down my thoughts, turning the chaos of my emotions into something tangible. Emily read every draft, offering encouragement and feedback. It was messy and raw, but it felt cathartic. Meanwhile, Jason's world was unraveling. Our lawyer had sent him a formal letter, outlining the legal action we were prepared to take. He tried to plead with us, first with apologies, then with threats. But neither of us wavered. Emily and I had built a bond that was stronger than any of his manipulations. As the months passed, life began to take on a new rhythm. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city, a place that was entirely mine. I decorated it with bright, cheerful colors, filling it with plants and artwork that made me smile. Emily found a new job, one that gave her the flexibility to pursue her art. We still spoke regularly, but our conversations shifted from Jason to our futures. The turning point came when my story was published. It wasn't a bestseller or a viral sensation, but it was mine. Writing it had been a journey, a way to reclaim my voice and make sense of everything that had happened. The response was overwhelming. Emails from women who had gone through similar experiences, thanking me for sharing my truth. It was humbling and healing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Jason faded into the background of my life, A distant memory I rarely thought about. The legal case against him eventually settled, forcing him to pay restitution and publicly acknowledge his actions. It wasn't about the money or the apology, it was about closure. Through it all, Emily remained a constant presence. She became more than just an ally. She became a friend, a sister, someone who understood me in a way few others could. Together we had taken something ugly and turned it into something beautiful, a second chance, a second life. Looking back, I realized how far I had come. The woman who had stood in that apartment, shattered and betrayed, was almost unrecognizable to me now. I had found strength in my pain, courage in my vulnerability, and hope in the unlikeliest of places. This was my second life, and I was determined to live it fully. For myself. For the future. For the woman I had become. As the months went by, my new life began to settle into something unexpectedly peaceful. At first, I'd been consumed by the chaos, by the betrayal, by the anger, by the uncertainty of what my future could look like. But slowly, the pieces started falling into place. I wasn't just existing anymore. I was living. I was finding my way day by day. In a world that no longer included Jason. There were still moments of doubt, of course. Nights when I'd sit in my apartment alone, the silence too loud, the empty space too big. Those were the times I missed the idea of what we had, the dream of a life I thought was real. But then I'd remember. The way Jason's absence had felt like a weight lifted off my chest. The way my heart had started to heal the moment I stopped trying to hold on to something that was never mine to keep. Emily had become a regular part of my life. Not just a friend, but a true companion. We met for coffee on Sundays, walked through art galleries, and even signed up for a pottery class one week, both of us laughing at how bad we were at it. But it didn't matter. It was about the experience, the joy of finding new things together. Things that weren't tethered to a past filled with lies. At work, I started to shine again. I had always been good at what I did, but after the divorce, it was like a new version of myself had emerged. I was more confident, more assertive, not afraid to speak up or go after what I wanted. My colleagues noticed the change, and some of them even mentioned how I seemed lighter. I laughed at that. Lighter. I guess that was one way to put it. One day, I received an email from a woman I didn't recognize. The subject line simply said, "Your story helped me." The message was short and to the point. I was in a relationship just like yours. He lied to me, cheated on me, and I found out just like you. I've been reading your blog, and it made me realize that I'm not alone. Thank you for being brave enough to share your story. It hit me harder than I expected. I had never written with the intention of helping anyone, least of all strangers. But there it was, proof that my pain had been turned into something valuable. I had begun to see the power of sharing my truth, of taking the mess of my emotions and turning it into something that could help others. It was a humbling feeling. I replied to the woman, offering encouragement and support, and telling her that she wasn't alone. I told her that life did get better, that there was a light on the other side of the darkness. As the year progressed, the tension that had once suffocated me started to fade into a distant memory. I found myself growing stronger, more self-assured, but also softer in ways that I hadn't anticipated. There was a new vulnerability in me, one that wasn't tied to weakness but to strength. A vulnerability that allowed me to embrace new experiences without fear, without holding back. There was a man at work, Matt, who had been a quiet presence in my life for months. He was smart, kind, and always had a way of making me laugh when I needed it most. I had been cautious at first, reluctant to even entertain the idea of dating again, of opening myself up to someone new. But Matt was different. He didn't rush me, didn't push. He let me take my time, letting our friendship grow naturally without expectations. One Friday evening after a particularly long week, he asked if I wanted to grab dinner. It was casual, he said, just to unwind. We ended up at a cozy restaurant, tucked away on a quiet street. The atmosphere was intimate, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the stirrings of something familiar. Something that had been absent from my life for far too long. We talked for hours about everything and nothing, and by the end of the night I felt lighter. Not because of him exactly, but because I realized that I was starting to trust again. It wasn't about replacing Jason, or trying to find someone who could heal me. It was about me learning to let go, about allowing myself to be open to the possibility of connection once more. Over the next few months, Matt and I spent more time together. It was slow, easy. I never felt pressured to be anything other than myself. I could still hear the echoes of my past in the quiet moments, but they no longer controlled me. In Matt's company I found peace, not just because of who he was, but because I had finally started to forgive myself for everything I'd allowed myself to endure. Emily and I still talked often, but now our conversations were filled with plans and dreams. She'd begun to paint again, and I had started writing regularly, small essays, short stories about my experiences. It felt like I was reclaiming parts of myself I had long forgotten. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. It was a Sunday morning in early spring when Emily and I decided to take a day trip out of the city. We drove along winding roads, the windows down, the fresh air filling the car. We stopped at a small vineyard in the countryside, and while sipping wine, I reflected on how far I had come. This wasn't the life I had imagined when I was married to Jason, but it was my life. It was more than enough. I had learned that sometimes the most painful moments are the ones that lead us to our truest selves. Through betrayal I had found strength. Through heartbreak I had found healing. And through loss I had learned to love myself again. The sun was setting as we drove home, and as I looked out over the hills, I realized something important. I was no longer the woman who had been betrayed. I was the woman who had rebuilt her life. And in that moment I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. Strange how life works. Just when you think you've reached the point where everything has settled, where the pieces of your shattered past are in place, something shifts again. But this time it was different. The shift didn't feel like a tragedy. It felt like an opportunity. And I wasn't afraid anymore. The first few months with Matt had been easy, uncomplicated. He was patient, understanding, never pushing me to move faster than I was ready for. Our dates were casual, long walks, dinners at hole-in-the-wall restaurants, trips to the local bookstore. But as time passed, I began to feel something more stir in me. Something that had been dormant for a long time. There was a tenderness between us, a connection that seemed effortless, as if we were two people who had been waiting for each other without even knowing it. I'll admit I was still hesitant. Every now and then, a memory of Jason would surface, an image of him smiling at me, a quiet moment we shared before everything had unraveled. But those moments were fewer now. They didn't haunt me as they once had. And when I looked at Matt, I saw something new. I saw trust. I saw respect. I saw someone who didn't need to prove himself, who didn't have anything to hide. That was the difference between him and Jason, the freedom to be myself without the fear of being deceived. One evening, a few months after we'd started dating, Matt and I found ourselves sitting on a rooftop, watching the sunset. It had become one of our favorite things to do. Just sitting together, letting the quiet moments stretch out between us. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, and there was a cool breeze in the air. "Do you ever think about the past?" he asked, his voice soft, almost as if he didn't want to break the peaceful silence. I paused, watching the clouds shift in the distance. I hadn't expected him to ask that. "Sometimes," I said, my voice steady, "but not as much as I used to." He looked at me, his expression gentle but curious. "What do you think about when you do?" "I think about how broken I was," I said, my gaze shifting to him. "How I let someone take so much from me. But also, I think about how far I've come. How I'm not that person anymore." Matt nodded, taking my hand in his. "You're stronger than you know," he said, his words holding a weight of truth I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. But I let them sit with me, knowing he meant every word. That night, I didn't just feel like I was in a new relationship. I felt like I was beginning a new chapter of my life. The past had shaped me, yes, but it no longer defined me. It wasn't about erasing the hurt or pretending it never happened. It was about accepting it, understanding it, and moving forward. In the months that followed, Matt and I grew closer. It wasn't a dramatic whirlwind. It was steady, like the growth of a tree, slow but inevitable. I never rushed things, and neither did he. We took our time. There were moments when I found myself looking at him, wondering if this was what it felt like to truly be loved, without manipulation, without games, without lies. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to fully embrace that possibility. Emily and I continued to support each other, but our lives had diverged in ways that were both exciting and comforting. She had started showing her artwork in local galleries, and her paintings were slowly gaining recognition. I felt a deep sense of pride when I saw her work on display. Pride for her courage to follow her passion, and pride for the strength we had both found in each other after everything we'd been through. We talked less about Jason now, though the conversation would occasionally drift back to him when we were feeling nostalgic or needed to vent. In those moments we were no longer angry. We had both moved on, and that, in itself, was a victory. But the real victory was in how much we had changed. We weren't the same women we had been when we first met. We had both learned that life didn't wait for you to be ready. It didn't ask for permission. It just kept moving forward whether you were ready or not. And all you could do was decide what you were going to do with that momentum. By the time summer rolled around again, I had started to feel like my life was truly my own. It wasn't perfect, and I wasn't naive enough to think it would always be smooth sailing. There would be challenges, disappointments, and maybe even more heartbreak along the way. But I knew now that I could handle it. I could rise above it. I could grow from it. Matt and I spent weekends exploring the city, finding new places to eat, new spots to relax. It was easy, natural. But one Sunday, as we were walking through a park, he stopped suddenly, turning to face me. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of something I hadn't heard before. "I don't want to rush you, but I need to ask you something important." I looked up at him, my heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" Matt took a deep breath. "I want to be with you. I want us to be more than just dating. I'm not asking for an answer right away, but I need you to know that I'm serious about this. About you." The words settled in my chest, warm and steady. It was as if everything that had come before had led to this moment. The pain, the healing, the rebuilding. It had all brought me here. To a place where I could say without hesitation that I was ready. "I'm serious about you too," I said, my voice steady, my heart full. "Let's take it one step at a time." And so we did. It wasn't a grand declaration. There were no fireworks or dramatic gestures. But it was real and it was honest. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that love, true love, was something I could have without the shadows of betrayal hanging over me. As the seasons changed, so did I. I found strength in the quiet moments, in the way I learned to stand on my own 2 feet. The lessons I had learned from Jason, about trust, about self-worth, about resilience, had transformed into something powerful. I no longer defined myself by my past, but by my present. And my present was a life I had fought for, a life I had earned. And now, with Matt by my side, I felt like I was ready for whatever the future might bring. Because I knew that no matter what happened, I had already found the most important thing: my own happiness. As time moved on, the weight of the past became less of a burden, and I started embracing the present with a sense of freedom I hadn't known in years. My relationship with Matt deepened, and our connection began to feel like something I had been waiting for my whole life without even realizing it. There was no rush, no urgency, just a shared understanding that we were both building something meaningful, step by step. We were 2 people who had lived through their own trials, and now we were learning to be with each other in a way that felt right. The world around us seemed to fall into place. My job, which had once felt like a treadmill of monotony, now gave me a sense of pride. I'd been promoted to a role that required more responsibility and creativity. It was challenging, but it pushed me in ways that made me grow professionally and personally. Every day, I felt a little more confident in my abilities, a little more secure in the person I was becoming. One night, after a long day of work, Matt and I took a walk by the river. It was one of those crisp fall evenings, where the air smells of earth and wood smoke, and the world feels still. We walked in comfortable silence, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the fallen leaves. There was something about the moment that made everything feel right. Everything that had come before, the heartbreak, the betrayal, no longer defined me. It had shaped me, yes, but it had also prepared me for this. We stopped at a bench near the water, and I sat down, staring at the darkening sky. The city lights shimmered in the distance, but here by the water, it felt like we were in our own world. I turned to look at Matt, whose gaze was fixed on the horizon. "I never thought I'd be here, you know?" I said softly, my voice almost lost in the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. "I never thought I'd be in a place where I felt whole again." Matt turned to me, his eyes soft but steady. "You are whole," he said quietly. "You've always been whole. You just had to remember that." His words hit me harder than I expected. It was true. The pain of my past had convinced me I was broken, that I had to fix myself. But over time I had come to realize that there was nothing to fix. I wasn't broken. I was evolving. I was learning how to be myself again, without the need for someone else to validate my worth. "Thank you," I whispered, and I wasn't sure if I was thanking him for his words or for simply being there. Being the kind of person who made me feel seen, heard, and appreciated in a way I hadn't known I needed. We didn't speak much after that. Instead, we sat there side by side watching the river flow past. There was no need for more words. The silence was comfortable, peaceful. For the first time in years, I felt completely at ease in my own skin. And in his presence I felt truly loved, not just for the person I was now, but for the person I had been, and the person I was becoming. As the weeks went by, Matt and I began to talk more seriously about the future. We both knew it was still early in our relationship, but there was an unspoken understanding that we were both on the same page. I had seen what it looked like when things were built on lies, and now I was seeing what it looked like when things were built on truth. And it was beautiful. There was no rush. We were just enjoying each other's company, savoring the quiet moments of companionship and trust. But it wasn't all just about Matt. It was also about me. I was learning how to live for myself, how to be the person I wanted to be without constantly seeking approval or validation from others. I'd spent so much of my life in the shadow of someone else's expectations. Jason's lies had taught me how easily I could lose myself in someone else's narrative. But now I was reclaiming my story. I was finally writing my own ending. I spent more time focusing on my passions. I took up writing again, diving into it with a fervor I hadn't known in years. I didn't have any specific goals in mind. No big aspirations of becoming a published author or anything like that. It was just for me. But as the words flowed, I began to realize how much I had to say, and how powerful it was to put my experiences down on paper. Emily, too, was flourishing. She had found a new studio space and was working on a series of paintings inspired by her travels. She had become something of a local artist, her work catching the attention of collectors and galleries. The sense of joy and fulfillment she radiated was contagious, and it only made me more excited about the future. As for my relationship with Matt, it continued to grow in the most natural way. One evening, he came over to my apartment, carrying a bottle of wine in a small wrapped box. He handed it to me with a smile that made my heart flutter. "What's this?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Open it," he said. I tore off the wrapping paper, revealing a small silver locket inside. It was simple, elegant, and timeless. "I thought you might like it," he said, his voice soft. "You don't have to wear it, but I wanted to give you something that would remind you of how far you've come, of how strong you are." I was speechless. It wasn't the gift itself, but the thought behind it. It was a symbol of everything we had shared, of everything we were building together. A quiet acknowledgement that we were both in this for the long haul. I put the locket on and Matt smiled, a quiet but knowing smile that spoke volumes. He didn't need to say anything. The gesture was enough. That night we sat together just talking and laughing. There were no grand gestures, no overwhelming moments of drama. Just two people who had found something real, something grounded in mutual respect and shared experience. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that I wasn't waiting for something to happen anymore. I wasn't waiting for my life to finally fall into place because it had already done so. I had made it happen. Through the pain, through the heartbreak, through the lessons and the healing, I had created the life I wanted. I had rebuilt myself, and in the process I had found someone who truly saw me. And that, in itself, was more than enough. I looked at Matt, and for the first time I understood what true contentment felt like. It wasn't about finding perfection. It was about finding peace, and knowing that no matter what, I was finally where I needed to be. A few months passed, and with each passing day, my life took on a more defined shape. I could feel it in my bones. The sense of permanence that had once seemed so elusive was finally here. I no longer woke up every morning questioning my place in the world. No longer spent sleepless nights wondering what went wrong with Jason, or whether I would ever find a way to trust again. Instead, I woke up with purpose, knowing exactly where I stood in my own life and how far I had come. Matt and I had settled into a routine that felt comfortable, grounded. On weekends, we spent time exploring new parts of the city, enjoying simple things. An afternoon in the park, A cozy evening at home with a movie and a homemade dinner. Sometimes we'd take spontaneous trips out of town, just for the fun of it. He had become my anchor, but not in the way I had imagined when I was younger. He didn't complete me. No, he simply complemented the person I had grown into, someone strong, independent, and free. With him, I didn't feel the need to pretend or perform. I could just be, and that was a feeling I had longed for without even knowing it. I found myself thinking less about the past, and when I did, it wasn't with the same sting of betrayal. Jason was just a chapter in my life now, a chapter that had ended a long time ago. Sure, I had spent a lot of energy on anger and grief, but as I looked back, I realized that those emotions had been the catalyst for my change. Without the heartache, I might not have had the drive to rebuild myself, to reclaim my own voice. And for that, in a strange way, I could almost be thankful. I had started writing more seriously, too. The small pieces I had written before had blossomed into full-fledged essays and articles, some of which I had begun to submit for publication. It was something I did purely for the love of it, but seeing my work published, having someone else read the words I had poured my soul into, was a satisfaction I couldn't quite describe. It was a reminder of how far I had come, how much I had learned, and how much I had to offer. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk, writing in the quiet solitude of my apartment, I received a call from Emily. She had some exciting news. Her artwork had been accepted into a prestigious art exhibition in New York. It was the kind of opportunity she had been working toward for years, and hearing her voice crack with joy on the other end of the line filled me with so much pride for her that it almost brought me to tears. "I can't believe it," she said, her voice full of disbelief and excitement. "This is it. This is the moment I've been waiting for. And I couldn't have done it without you. You've always been there, cheering me on." I smiled into the phone, my heart swelling. "You've always had it in you, Em. I'm just so proud of you. You deserve this more than anyone." As we spoke, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the friendship that had kept me grounded through the darkest times. Emily wasn't just my best friend anymore. She was my sister in spirit, the person who had witnessed my transformation, who had held my hand through the hardest moments of my life. And now we were both standing on the other side of our pain, stronger and more fulfilled than ever before. That evening, Matt and I went out to celebrate. He had been quietly supportive of my work, always encouraging me to pursue my writing. But tonight, it felt like we were celebrating something bigger than just a job or a personal accomplishment. It felt like we were celebrating the lives we had built from the rubble of our pasts. We went to a small, intimate bistro I had discovered a few months ago, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The lighting was soft and warm, the air filled with the pleasant hum of conversation. As we sat down at a candlelit table, I noticed how Matt's eyes crinkled when he smiled, how his presence had become a constant comfort in my life. "I'm really proud of you," he said, taking my hand across the table. "You've worked so hard, and I can see how much this means to you. You've come so far from where you were." His words made my heart flutter, but they also made me realize something important. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking for someone to save me. I wasn't waiting for someone to come in and fix the pieces of my life. I had already done that. I had saved myself. And Matt, in his own way, had simply stood by me, supporting me as I became the person I was always meant to be. The dinner was simple, but it was perfect in its own way. We shared stories, laughed over the wine, and spoke about our dreams for the future. We didn't make any grand promises, but there was an unspoken understanding between us that what we had was real. It wasn't about escaping the past. It was about building something new, something better. Together. As the evening wore on, we stepped outside into the cool night air. The streets were quieter now, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement from a light rain that had passed through earlier. We walked hand in hand, our footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. "I love you," Matt said, his voice low and sincere. It wasn't the first time he had said it, but somehow tonight, it felt like the words carried even more weight. I stopped in my tracks, turning to face him. "I love you too," I said, my voice steady, sure of myself. In that moment, I realized that love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about waiting for the perfect circumstances or the perfect person. It was about two people coming together with all their flaws, their histories, and their hopes for the future, and choosing each other every single day. We didn't rush back to my apartment. Instead, we took our time, enjoying the quiet comfort of simply being together. And as we walked, I realized that, just like the city around us, my life was constantly changing. It was a constant ebb and flow, a series of moments that built upon each other, each one leading me closer to who I was meant to become. As we reached my door, Matt leaned in, kissing me softly on the lips. "Good night," he whispered, his words gentle. "I'll see you in the morning." I watched him walk away, feeling a deep sense of contentment. The past had shaped me, but it no longer held me captive. I had found my way, not by holding on to what had been, but by embracing the possibility of what could be. And with Matt by my side, I felt ready to face whatever came next. There was no fear anymore, no doubt. Just the certainty that my future, like the city we lived in, was full of possibilities. The next few months felt like a delicate balance between moving forward and reflecting on the path I had taken to get here. I'd always thought that happiness was something you stumbled upon, that it would come to you when the timing was right. But now I understood that happiness was something you built, something you fought for in your own quiet ways. It wasn't about big moments or dramatic transformations. It was about the small, everyday victories, the way you could wake up with a sense of purpose, how you could look in the mirror and no longer see someone broken, but someone whole, someone complete in their own skin. Matt and I continued to spend more time together, our bond growing deeper with each passing day. I had started noticing how much his presence in my life grounded me. He was calm, steady, and always seemed to know how to make me feel understood. And not just understood, but seen in a way that no one else had ever done. With him, I could let go of the walls I had built around myself over the years, walls that were once necessary for survival, but which now felt like burdens I was eager to release. Our relationship was not without its challenges. We still had moments of doubt, the occasional clash of personalities or differing views. But what made our connection special was that we worked through those moments, not by avoiding the issues, but by confronting them with honesty and care. We had both been through pain, and we knew the value of communication, how important it was to speak up, to be heard, and to listen. Emily's success continued to soar, and I couldn't have been more proud of her. She had made a name for herself in the art world, her exhibitions drawing attention from collectors and critics alike. I could see the changes in her too. Her confidence had blossomed, and it was impossible to miss the spark in her eyes when she talked about her work. She was finally living the life she had always dreamed of, and I knew it was just the beginning for her. The more I saw Emily thrive, the more I began to think about my own future, my own dreams. I had always written for myself, but now I was wondering if there was something more I could do with my words. I had no expectations of fame or fortune, but I wanted to use my voice. I wanted to reach people who might be feeling the same way I had felt, lost, broken, unsure of their worth. I wanted to tell them that there was hope, that they could rebuild their lives, that they could be stronger than they ever thought possible. I wasn't sure exactly how that would happen, but the idea of sharing my experiences felt like the next step in my journey. One evening, Matt and I found ourselves in one of our favorite spots, a quiet rooftop bar with a breathtaking view of the city. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow across the skyline, and the air was crisp with the promise of fall. We had decided to take the evening off from our usual routines and simply enjoy the moment. I leaned back in my chair, watching as the sky shifted colors, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Life, I realized, wasn't something that happened in an instant. It wasn't about one pivotal moment that changes everything. It was a series of moments, a collection of choices, of people who come and go, of places you visit and things you experience. And each of those moments, whether big or small, has the power to shape you. Matt reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "sometimes I still can't believe how far we've come, how much we've both grown." I smiled, squeezing his hand. "It feels like it was a lifetime ago, doesn't it?" "A lifetime ago," he echoed, his eyes warm, filled with something deeper than just affection. "But we're here now, and that's all that matters." I didn't say anything else because he had summed it up perfectly. The past had been a difficult journey, but it had brought us here, to this place where we could finally begin to heal and grow. I wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time I wasn't afraid of it. I had no idea where it was leading, but I knew I had the strength to face whatever came next. Over the next few weeks, I continued to focus on my writing, allowing my ideas to flow more freely than ever before. I had a sense of purpose now, and it felt like my words had finally found a direction. I started submitting some of my work to different publications, including personal essays about the journey of healing and rebuilding. One of them was picked up by a well-known magazine, and when I received the email confirming they wanted to publish it, I felt a surge of pride. It wasn't the start of a new career, at least not yet, but it was a validation of everything I had worked for. And that validation was enough to fuel me for months. Meanwhile, Matt and I continued to explore our relationship. We talked about everything, our fears, our hopes, our pasts. But we also talked about the future. He had never pressured me to rush things, but we both knew that we were building something lasting. It wasn't just about being in love, it was about partnership. We both valued independence, but we also recognized the strength that came from choosing to be with someone. On a weekend getaway, while we were sitting on the porch of a cozy cabin in the mountains, Matt turned to me with a serious expression on his face. "I've been thinking a lot about us," he said slowly, "about the future. And I want you to know, I'm not going anywhere. I want to be with you." His words landed heavily in the silence between us. I wasn't surprised. Matt had always been steady, and I knew that he saw a future with me. But hearing him say it, hearing the certainty in his voice, made something shift inside me. "I want that too," I said softly, my heart full. In that moment I knew that no matter what came our way, we were ready to face it together. There was no more fear of being abandoned, no more fear of betrayal. We had both learned the hard way that nothing in life was guaranteed. But we also knew that love, trust, and respect were the foundation of everything we were building. Later that evening we sat on the porch, sipping wine under the stars, the sound of crickets filling the air. I thought about how far I had come, how much had changed. I had been broken once, but I was no longer the person I had been. I had rebuilt myself piece by piece, and in doing so I had learned the value of my own strength. The future was unknown, but for the first time in my life I wasn't afraid of it. Whatever challenges we would face, whatever obstacles lay ahead, I knew that I could handle them. Because I wasn't alone anymore. And neither was Matt. We were partners in this journey, and that, I realized, was the greatest gift I could have ever asked for. As we sat there side by side, I felt the peace of knowing that I was finally exactly where I was supposed to be. As the weeks unfolded, I found myself settling more deeply into this new chapter of my life. There was something incredibly liberating about knowing that I had fully let go of my past. The pain, the heartbreak, the betrayal. All of it had faded into the background. It didn't define me anymore. What defined me now was how I chose to move forward, how I made space for new experiences, new possibilities. Matt and I had grown even closer, our connection becoming a steady pulse between us. There was a quiet comfort in the way we had found each other, in the way our lives had intertwined. We still had our moments of vulnerability, times when old wounds surfaced, but we had learned how to navigate those moments together. Communication was no longer something we tiptoed around. It had become the bridge that kept us strong, even when things weren't perfect. I had started to feel more at home in my own skin. The constant weight I had once carried around, the nagging sense of fear that my world would crumble again, was lifting. My days weren't defined by anxiety anymore. Instead, they were full of intention. I had started to think about the future in a way that felt exciting rather than daunting. For the first time, I was considering what I truly wanted, not just for the next few months or years, but for my entire life. What kind of person did I want to be? What kind of impact did I want to have? My writing continued to evolve as well. I had begun contributing to more outlets, sharing my personal experiences and perspectives with others. The response was overwhelming. People wrote to me, telling me how much my words had resonated with them, how they had found comfort in knowing they weren't alone in their struggles. It was humbling to hear, and it made me feel as though I was finally using my voice in a way that mattered. The idea that something I had written could help someone else, that it could make them feel seen and understood, that was everything I had hoped for. One afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call from a literary agent. She had read one of my essays that had been published in an online journal, and was interested in discussing the possibility of turning it into a book. First, I thought it was some kind of joke. I had never imagined that my words would ever be seen as something worth publishing beyond a blog post or an article. But after the initial shock wore off, I felt a rush of excitement. This was real. This was the next step in my journey. The agent, whose name was Sarah, told me she had been following my work for a while and thought my writing had the potential to resonate with a wider audience. We spoke for almost an hour about the idea of turning my essays into a book, a collection of personal stories about healing, reclaiming your life, and finding strength in the aftermath of betrayal. She was enthusiastic, and her energy was contagious. We discussed what the process might look like, the timeline, the possibilities. When I hung up the phone, I sat there for a long time, letting the weight of the conversation sink in. I had always dreamed of writing a book, but it had never felt like something within my reach. Now it was staring me in the face, and I couldn't deny the sense of pride and accomplishment that swelled in my chest. This was more than just a professional milestone. This was a symbol of everything I had overcome, everything I had worked toward. That evening I couldn't wait to tell Matt. I found him in the kitchen, preparing dinner as he often did. He looked up when I walked in, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Guess what?" I said, barely able to contain my excitement. He raised an eyebrow. "Strong. Something that would last." "Yes," I said, my voice steady and sure. "I think we're ready." The next few months were filled with the kind of excitement I had never known. We found a house, a small but beautiful place with a garden and plenty of space for a family. We painted the walls, chose furniture, and talked about what we wanted our home to feel like. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and it was a symbol of everything we had worked toward. As the days passed and the house began to feel more like home, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. The chaos and the heartbreak of the past had been replaced with something steady, something solid. This was my second life. The life I had fought for, the life I had created from the ashes. It wasn't without its challenges, but it was mine. And for the first time I felt truly at peace with that. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. And the future, with all its possibilities, felt wide open. As the months passed, life continued to unfold in ways I never could have anticipated. The house had become our sanctuary, a place where every room told a story of rebuilding, of new beginnings. Matt and I spent hours working together, painting walls, assembling furniture, planting flowers in the garden. Each task brought us closer, solidified the bond we had worked so hard to restore. The life we were creating was one of balance, of understanding, and of quiet joy. I'd written a second book by that point, a collection of essays and reflections on the journey of healing. It was more introspective, more focused on the small everyday victories than on the major milestones. I wasn't the same woman who had written her first book in the midst of heartbreak. That version of me felt like someone else entirely, someone I had mourned and then let go of. The woman I had become was more whole, more connected to herself and her purpose. I was no longer looking over my shoulder at the mistakes of the past. I was building something entirely new. My second book felt like the final piece of that transformation, the culmination of everything I had learned in the years since my life had turned upside down. The release of the book felt different, more grounded. I still received messages from readers, but they were no longer filled with sorrow or pain. Instead, they were filled with gratitude, with hope, with shared experiences of overcoming life's most difficult challenges. There was a deep sense of connection in these messages, and it reminded me of why I had written in the first place, to show others that they were not alone. I had gone through my own hell, and I had emerged stronger, and I wanted others to know that they too could find their way through the darkness. Matt's business had also taken off. The project he had started on a whim, inspired by his own desire to make a change in his life, had grown into a thriving company. He had worked tirelessly, investing his energy and time into something he believed in, and it had paid off. He was happier than I had ever seen him, and as I watched him grow into his role, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. We were both building our dreams side by side, and I knew we were only getting started. There were still difficult moments, there always would be, but they were no longer the defining ones. Instead, the struggles were part of the process, just like the triumphs. We knew how to face them together with love, patience, and trust. And sometimes when life got overwhelming, we would pause and just be with each other, appreciating how far we had come. One evening, as we sat on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple, Matt leaned over and kissed me gently. It was a kiss that said everything: love, gratitude, the quiet acknowledgement of everything we had built. I'm so glad we found each other, he whispered, his voice full of emotion. I smiled and rested my head on his shoulder, feeling a peace I had never known before. Me too, I said softly. More than I ever thought was possible. And in that moment I realized that the second life I had started to build wasn't just about the house, the book, or the career. It was about the way I had learned to trust again, both in myself and in the people I loved. It was about the quiet joy of being loved, of loving in return, and of knowing that no matter what, I was finally home. Life had given me a second chance. And this time I was going to make sure I cherished every single moment of it. The end.